everyone, and thank you, Dave, for your kind introduction. I'd also like to thank the Earth Sciences Department and the Farvolden Day Committee for their invitation to be the 2021 Farvolden Lecturer. This event has always been a highlight annually for me, and or at least professionally speaking, and a homecoming for alumni such as myself, and connecting with friends and colleagues over a growing population of earth science graduates and hydrogeologists and collaborators. It was noted the other day that this is the 26th Farvolden Day starting in the fall of '96, and that happened to be the year I graduated from Waterloo with my PhD. So I thought that was serendipitous for me. Today I will present an overview of research insights on bedrock flow systems, informed over 35 years of field investigations. And first, I thought I would introduce the style of the research that my group is performing, focusing on high-resolution field methods to inform these flow systems and contaminant plumes and source zones in the subsurface. And that requires us working at multiple scales using multidisciplinary tools and collecting those data to inform various models to predict the outcomes. And this map is just a showing of most of our research sites. They're scattered across North America, as you can see here, in a variety of hydrogeologic settings. Now, this field-based research program is funded by private landowners and groundwater equipment and manufacturing companies, along with municipalities and consultants. And often we're leveraging these funds with government support, especially NSERC. And because of the variety of field systems that are multidisciplinary, there's a strong propensity for collaboration, and these collaborations happen to last for many years. And we're very dependent on the excellent students and postdocs and interns that work in our group, and the commitment of my laboratory and field managers that have stuck with me over the many years now. And this is true for a number of senior research staff here as well. I've highlighted those who have stuck with me for many years and have providing their own in-depth knowledge in enabling this research to go forward. So here we just see a variety of fractured rock exposures, and the main take home here is the diversity of the fracture networks that we might encounter, and we have to essentially accommodate in our studies. And it's the fractures that dominate the groundwater flow through the system, and the ones that are hydraulically active or connected are the ones that are important, at least in terms of flow and transport. And just like in porous media, if we can estimate the fracture porosity, we can divide the Darcy flux by that fracture porosity and estimate the average linear groundwater velocity in the system. And in sedimentary rocks, where I've maintained a continual focus throughout my research endeavors, we have to consider the substantial matrix porosity that exists between the fractures. And I guess one of the things that sets the stage here for our work is the nature of our fracture networks tends to make things incredibly complicated or complex. And this was stated by Shlomo Newman back in 2005 in terms of what some of our important future challenges are in hydrogeology. And fractured rock is particularly important here in Canada, with many of our regional aquifers being fractured media, as stated here by Alfonso Rivera. And just a quick comment about Bob Farvolden. He happened to be present in the department when I was a PhD student in the early 90s. And I've learned about Bob mainly through my collaboration with John Cherry and Dave Rudolph and others that knew him, I suppose, much more closely than myself. But in researching his past and understanding his contributions and so on, I think what is most notable here that I tried to highlight on this slide is his association or leadership role with creating teams of hydrogeologists, so what we might refer to as a critical mass. And I think that was due to his view, I think that there's hydrogeology is a very diverse discipline in its own right, and that complexity benefits from several minds working collectively and together. But he was inspiring to many of us, and his particular focus was on 3D groundwater flow systems and water resources, groundwater resources. And I think he also had a commitment to field observations informing scientific discovery. So when I arrived in January of 1991, Bob had recently retired, but he was still very much present in the department, even though he had a job as a senior scientific advisor for the National Groundwater Association. He would often drop into the department when he was in Waterloo, or certainly on the weekends to pick up books and drop in to see who was working in their offices that day. And I think that's when many of the conversations would happen with the graduate students, or at the coffee machine, where many of us were waiting for a fresh pot of coffee. And I think what was most remarkable about Bob is he never hesitated to direct a question to any one of us to provoke a conversation that was interesting and stimulating, and often left us going back to our offices thinking about those conversations a bit more deeply. And I suppose I was particularly impacted by an impromptu tutorial that Bob Farvolden gave to a group of 4 PhD students when we were preparing for a comprehensive exam. And he saw us in the boardroom talking and working at the blackboard, and he could tell we were talking about groundwater flow systems, and he invited himself in and asked us a bunch of questions. And an hour later or two, I think we went, we couldn't believe our luck. In any case, I will continue on here to talk about my early Waterloo days. I came to Waterloo in '91 to study with Bob Gillam and John Cherry. Both of these guys are pioneers on the role of diffusion in hydrogeology, but worked at very different scales. So that was certainly my focus that I took on with looking at chlorinated solvent behavior in fractured clays as an analog and less expensive endeavor than working in fractured rocks. And I developed a conceptual model for DNAPL persistence, or rapid dissolution in fractured porous media that pertain to clays and sedimentary rocks, and essentially built that off of simple models and laboratory and field experiments that help to inform the diffusive fluxes away from NAPL in natural porous media. And as I think about that work that I was doing, it connects back to Bob Farvolden through John Cherry and some of the work that they had been doing throughout the decades prior to my arrival at Waterloo. And another side of Bob Farvolden that I guess struck me in conversations with John Cherry is how he just would give advice kind of in this nonchalant way. So John just relayed a story to me a few months ago that with his first grant, he was talking to Bob about what he should spend his money on. And Bob just wryly said, go stick some piezometers in the ground and you'll be surprised what comes back. It'll drive good science. So working in fractured clays, come to find out Bob Farvolden had an early paper with his student Roy Williams in 1967, pointing out the importance of joints in glacial tills in Illinois. Certainly, John Cherry picked up on that theme and dedicated his career to fractured clays. And I'm showing a picture of the Laidlaw pit here on the right, which is where I spent a considerable amount of my time as a PhD student, learning from the previous PhD students, some of them who had long gone from Waterloo, but their theses were essentially my textbooks. And then the students that were there with me who served as my mentors and guidance and created lots of conversation pieces. So anyway, I'm grateful to these fellow students who helped me through the program and certainly gave me lots of ideas to take forward in my research career. And I just want to emphasize here that I see this science as a multi-generational collaboration, and I really enjoy this picture of Bob Farvolden talking with John Cherry, as well as pointing out here that I've had the luxury of working with John for several decades, advancing some of these ideas. So after my PhD, I continued as a research faculty member at Waterloo and mentored several master's students. And the one that I'm highlighting here happens to just emphasize the work that I was supposed to do originally in my PhD was to do controlled release experiments in a fractured clay. And this was essentially a parallel activity to the many Borden release experiments in sandy aquifers. The concept that John Cherry had set up with Laidlaw at the time was that if we spill these small volumes of solvent, we'll watch their behavior and observe that and quantify what's going on, but easily be able to spill or dig those up and put them into this permitted hazardous waste disposal facility just on the other side of the berm. So a convenient place to do this type of work. Anyway, Glenn Kirkpatrick took on the project from the designs that we had been thinking about before. And so these release experiments occurred. And then after 2 weeks and after 4 months, we decided to do continuous coring through those contaminated zones and evaluate the concentration variability by doing high resolution depth discrete sampling. And what you see after 2 weeks is a very erratic concentration profile spanning over several orders of magnitude in all 3 of the cores that are shown here. And after 4 months, what we see is an equilibration of concentrations throughout the profile. Our samples that were close to fractures and farther away from fractures were all more or less the same concentration, at least in the upper couple of meters below the release. And then that's where the fractures were closely spaced. And below that, you can see that the erratic concentrations occur again, and that's where we had evidence or knew that the fractures were more widely spaced based on previous research. And then I requested Glenn to go after detailed profiles orthogonal to the visible fractures. And we could see DNAPL persistent in one of the fractures, which is located at the 10 centimeter distance along this transverse profile. And another one, we couldn't see DNAPL, but our sampling scale on the order of a few millimeters apart allowed us to measure the concentration and the mass that had diffused away from the fractures and determine the diffusion coefficients for this set of conditions. So, as John Cherry had promised me, fractured clays were good analogs for sedimentary rock. And after I graduated, I was eager to get back to some of the challenges that I had been struggling with as a young professional at Eastman Kodak, where chlorinated solvents were used in abundance and regularly released or accidentally released to the subsurface. And the nature of the hydrogeology in upstate New York is similar sedimentary rock as we have here in southern Ontario. And what I had discovered in those several years working for Eastman Kodak is we didn't really understand the nature of the problem we were dealing with, which didn't leave us with a good prognosis for coming up with reasonable solutions for these problems either. But I had learned at Kodak by my consultants that diffusion was an important process. We could read about it here in Fries and Cherry and see that diffusion was going to have a strong impact on transport in fractured porous rock and clays. And if we have sorption, that retardation effect on the plumes and the fractures is going to be even stronger. And if we don't have much porosity, like we have in crystalline rocks, we can expect that matrix diffusion effect is going to be minimal or small. But it's what's happening at the fracture network scale that matters for plumes. And so just out of curiosity, I was working to evaluate the importance of the number of fractures here. And so Steve Chapman's created these 2 realizations that had similar bulk hydraulic conductivities. And one has a dense network of fractures with variable aperture, and the other one has a sparser network of fractures. And if we run TCE through these nearly identical flow domains, but different fracture networks, we can see a very distinct contrast in the plume behavior over 50 years. Not only is the plume front position very different, the internal concentration distributions are also different over several orders of magnitude. And we can see here in this outcrop, the icicles show variable transmissivities or discharges of water along this outcrop, as well as many fractures that appear visible but don't appear to be hydraulically connected or active. And unfortunately, our views of the subsurface are commonly through even smaller windows, and they become these boreholes. And so we're quite used to, as a profession, inferring the hydraulic activity of fractures from visible evidence, either geochemical weathering or staining, or something about the physical characteristics of these fractures, either through geophysical tools or perhaps core. But this brings me to the idea of using contaminant concentration profiles at intense spacing to perhaps elucidate which of those fractures are hydraulically active or not. The concept here is to use that technique at contaminated sites, using existing contamination as essentially my experimental areas. But in order to plan for that type of sampling, I did some one-dimensional modeling to show the extent of these diffusion halos away from fractures that might contain high concentrations of solute. And what this slide is aiming to present is how this can help guide our field methodology. So if we take TCE and think about the diffusion in a granite with its typical matrix porosity and properties versus a shale and a sandstone, we see that the extent of that diffusion halo after 40 years may be at least 30 centimeters for the granite, 45 centimeters for a typical shale, and over a meter for a sandstone. And so what I thought to myself at that time is, well, that's easy enough to do. It certainly is the millimeter scale I was working on before with clays over really short time periods. So this was the way we went into the field to do some of our experimental work with solvents in Bedrock. So this schematic diagram is meant to be a 5 or 10 foot length of continuous core, the typical core run. When it comes up at surface, we would log it quickly to identify its lithologic and fracture features, perhaps variability in geochemistry and things of note. And then we would decide how we might sample to determine these concentration profiles away from those presumed advective features. And this sampling style can be adaptive for different rock types and contaminant types or ages of contamination. What I was really emphasizing too in our own workflow, in our research program, was the value of core. My experience in the 80s and 90s was continuous core of bedrock was more expensive than direct drilling, and it became unpopular. And most people would skip that step in their investigation work. Yet I saw great potential here for providing the insights that were needed to inform the processes. And this would complement the borehole methods that we're also improving along the way. So the approach we're using are depth discrete sampling methods, not just concentration of contaminants. It might be isotopes of water and other indicators, as well as a hydraulic head and hydraulic conductivity and so forth. And this was the approach we wanted to use to understand plume behavior in sedimentary rock that really wasn't well understood at the time. The hypothesis for this research was that if we collected the data in sufficient detail to inform the processes and the parameters for these processes and the hydrogeologic structure or heterogeneity in the system, we could use that data to inform numerical models representing that system and simulate the past and future plume behavior. And this was essentially predicated on the excellent work that had already gone on at Waterloo, most notably the Stanford Waterloo natural gradient tracer experiment that happened in the early or mid 1980s. in the sense here that the controlled release allowed us to watch these plumes move through the system and observe the effects of advection and diffusion processes on these plumes as they migrated through the Borden Aquifer. But the challenge here was that I was not likely to get permission to do controlled releases, so the opportunity was to use these age-contaminated sites as these natural gradient tracer experiments. Diffusion halos were the focus, and the good thing was that we had a tracer. These chlorinated solvents were measurable over 5 or 6 orders of magnitude. So I'll take you to one of my early sites that I went to in the mid to late 90s. It's a site in upstate New York where PCE contamination got into a shallow black shell. You can see a picture of a core here. And this black shell has a high organic carbon content. Some lots of pyrite was observed along fracture veins and in the matrix, and 2 to 4% matrix porosity. An example of the rock core concentration profiles for PCE and TCE is shown here. You can see that the depth discrete measurements that with detected values are solid symbols, and the intensity of the sampling spacing plotted with depth over a log concentration scale. And we can see very high concentration peaks that are separated by very low or non-detect concentrations between those peaks. With the core logs and the geophysical logs, we can align those peaks with fractures, and that's what the red arrows represent along the right-hand side of this graph. So you can see there's a couple of dozen of fractures identified with the contaminant profile. What I've superimposed on this same graph are 5 blue lines that essentially horizontal lines that represent the position of transmissive fractures that were identified by open hole flow metering, both under non-pumping and pumping conditions. And this was work done by the USGS. And the take-home message from this collaborative work was the work published by the USGS based on the open hole flow metering suggested that there were only a few important transmissive fractures that were had significant length and through going through the system that were dominating the groundwater flow. In contrast, the rock core data that I had collected suggested that there were many more active fractures, and perhaps these fractures had variable aperture along their length and maybe truncated lengths, but cross-connected with other fractures that were open and connected. And this provided perhaps a very distinct view of the number of fractures and also how they were oriented and connected in the system. So the results from this early work convinced us that rock core VOC profiles were helpful in identifying the active fractures, and the diffusion halos also showed the distribution of the contaminant mass wasn't always consistent with the most transmissive fractures in the system, and these halos were resistant to drilling effects, so they were measurable and reliable. I'd like to go to another site in California. I started doing research at this site in '97 with a master's student. This happens to be a rocket engine testing facility where they use TCE to rinse out the combustion chambers that were tested on these stands that you can see in the photograph in the upper right. The sandstone is a marine turbidite sequence, so inner beds of sandstone and shale in a tectonically active area, so faults are also prominent in this area. And the TCE and rocket engine testing was predominantly most prolific in the 1950s and 1960s, so over about a 20-year period, although the last engine test, I think, was in 2006. In a corner of the site, we isolated a source area and a plume that was, I guess, readily identifiable. What we see here are 2 dashed lines that represent what I call transverse cross-sections, or transects. And those transects have multiple core locations along them. And data from those core profiles help to inform the center line of the plume that heads across those 2 transects and out to a final location, a C16-17 core location that is at the plume front. So again, similar style of rock core concentration data with depth here in this sandstone, taken by Sean Sterling in the late 90s. And the data here was demonstrative of the denupple phase. There was no remaining evidence of denupple at the time of this drilling, which would have been about 50 years after the start of rocket engine testing at the site. And many more profiles helped to inform this long sex, or this longitudinal section through the center line of the plume. So I averaged the depth discrete data in 5 or 6 meter intervals, and that gave us a chance to create this display where we've created the concentration profiles to kind of give you a more blended view of how the concentration distributions exist in this aquifer, more consistent with what we might expect with groundwater monitoring wells. And what we see with the measured concentrations in rock core with distance along the center line, we can see that the maximum concentrations decreased rapidly as we move to the plume front, decreasing, and I guess the best way to see it is a straight line plot on the semi-log concentration plot with distance showing that the plume front at MCLs may be a distance of about 1,000 meters away from the source area. So again, using FracTran as I guess an intuition building tool or simulate the site conditions, the field data for the matrix and the fracture network is used to inform this fracture network realization. So we would generate a statistical fracture net with variable apertures informed by those hydraulic apertures measured in the field, and the bulk hydraulic conductivity of the system needed to match pumping test results. And of course, the matrix parameters were also known. And we collaborated with structural geologists to get improved knowledge about this fracture network at the site. Professor Iden from Stanford and his postdoc, Nino Salona, are authors of that paper. So here's a sense of the hydraulic head distribution for this dense network of fractures, the fracture porosity estimate coming from FracTran, and the bulk hydraulic conductivity matching what we think is the case in the field. So here we see the strongly retarded plumes of TCE moving through that domain at 20 years, 50 years, and 100 years. The finite duration sources to represent the period when the TCE was mostly being released or spilled into the ground, so that 20-year period in the 50s and 60s, and then the mass in the system was allowed to continue to drift through this domain with time. And you can see that this rate of plume front migration at 4 orders of magnitude below the solubility essentially is very slow in the 50 to 100-year time period, couple of meters per year, but continuing to decrease. The output at 60 years is shown here at the bottom slide. It's averaged over the same 5 or 6 meter depth intervals to mimic what we did with the rock core data. And what's remarkable about this deterministic style of modeling is it shows a very similar style or character that we got from the rock core data, or the creeked rock core data. So we have the same distribution of each order of magnitude concentration with distance, as well as the fingering that we observed in the field. The rock core data also was able to observe the occurrence of degradation products like cis and vinyl chloride shown here. And the question we had in our mind was whether, even though this was evidence that degradation was occurring, the question was whether it was occurring in the fracture or in the matrix. And so to test whether that made much of a difference or how sensitive that answer needed to be to our problem, we simulated degradation rates with a half-life of 5 years in the fracture only, seen in the middle 3 panes, and then on the right-hand side, we show the same half-life for both the fracture and the matrix. And we can see that the fracture-only case doesn't show much distinction from the no degradation case on the left. But if we have degradation occurring at a slow half-life in the matrix, it has a profound impact on the conditions from 50 to 100 years and going forward. And the evidence that we put together to support the matrix degradation was DNA extractions from rock core, as well as thin sections that showed us the mineralogy and the organic carbon that could act as a substrate to support these sparse populations of microbes that might reside in the matrix. So as a result of some of this work, we've essentially listed the order of the processes according to their importance, at least to the point in time we were doing our studies. So in the first 50 years, these plumes have evolved, mostly dominated by the diffusion retardation along a dense network of advective fractures. And sorption helps to enhance that diffusive flux into the matrix. What we also observed is the apparent dispersion at the plume scale is strong, but not as important as the diffusion effect. And degradation is listed last here because it had little effect in the early 50 years, but we see it having a profound effect going forward. So the conceptual framework that was presented early on after my PhD was being field verified, at least in terms of the conditions in the source zone and sedimentary rock, and we could see the evolution of distinct stages of the plume. So very quickly, I'm going to show you some of these cartoon sketches. The top is a cross-section longitudinally through the system, and then we have a planned view footprint to illustrate the stages of conditions in sedimentary rock and pertinent to clays as well. Stages 1 and 2 are the release time and soon after the releases when things are redistributing and equilibrating, immobilizing the DNAPL, typically within the fracture network below the water table. And groundwater moving through this system essentially dissolves that DNAPL in the fracture network, carrying that dissolved mass down gradient, allowing the plume to grow and the plume front to propagate in the direction of groundwater flow. And over a few decades, what we've noticed is that these plumes reach a maximum extent or a quasi-steady state position. And we call this stage 4. And this happens to be the condition that we see throughout the site in California and other sites that we've looked at. But these cartoons and the information from these sites that we're specifically studying help to inform a general conceptual model for plume behavior in sedimentary rock. The other sites that I'm working on are in Ontario and Wisconsin, have very distinct geologic origins as well as hydrogeologic environments with different climate as well. But what we see from the 4 sites that I've been studying in detail over the last 25 years is the plumes are nearly as wide as they are long. And that's a very distinct condition for fractured sedimentary rock compared to sand and gravel aquifers, which we've come to know through our Borden experiments and others that followed at Cape Cod and the Maid site and so on. So 5 key elements that are common to these sedimentary rock sites where chlorinated solvents were the contaminant. Numerous hydraulically active fractures seem to be consistently occurring. The source zone evolution is strong in sedimentary rocks because of the combined influence of advection and diffusion, and the plume fronts are retarded as we would expect, affecting the plume lengths for these sites. And lateral spreading seems to also be stronger than what we would expect in porous media. And over 50, 60 years, the evidence of degradation is continuing. So now I'd like to move a bit closer to home. I've been studying a site in Cambridge, Ontario, in this Dolo stone aquifer that you see an outcrop shown below. But the opportunity here is to look at these plumes as potential threats to our municipal water supply wells as receptors. So in the map view here, you can see the green dots representing numerous water supply wells in a well field. And I guess the unfortunate event of this plume essentially being smack in the middle and heading straight to one of those water supply wells labeled G6. The contaminant here is metolachlor, which is a common herbicide, and it has a solubility of about 500 milligrams per liter and a drinking water limit of about 50 micrograms per liter in water. In cross-section, we have 30 meters of glacial sediments and 100-meter thick Slurian dolostone aquifer. And our research work showed, with rock core anyway, that the denapple had migrated all the way to the bottom of this aquifer at some earlier stage, sometime around the 1980s. So investigations in the 90s with conventional wells had pretty well established the limits in the position of the plume. And so we were strategically locating what we call golden spike high resolution data sets in the source area along a transect mid plume and then down gradient near the receptor. And this gave us a combined data set to map the concentration distributions in different snapshots in time. And what you can see here in 2005 versus 2011 is a nearly consistent situation, evidence for this quasi-steady state condition. Now I'll give us a look at the details of the internal plume concentrations along this AA prime transect in the middle of the plume. So the two time periods again, but what we see internal to the plume is concentration variability. And so these high concentration bullseyes show that a lot of the contaminant flux occurs over a small cross-sectional area. And it might vary in time in terms of where those high concentration zones might be. Sorry. So these data along the transect were used to calculate a total mass discharge at each of these time snapshots. And we have a third one added here at the bottom. So we can see that over time, the mass discharge across this plume has decreased significantly from 300 to 170 to 100 grams per year based on this detailed data set. And what's also interesting is the concentrations of metolachlor that are measurable in G6, although well below the MCL of 50. The early arrival occurred in 2001, just at the detection limit. The maximum concentration arrived at 2, and then the concentrations were steadily declining ever since then, consistent with the mass discharge up gradient being diminishing as well. This type of data was used to not jump into any immediate or emergency type of remediation activity due to the detection at G6, and it allowed the municipality to continue to use that pumping well without abandoning it. It allows me to complete the conceptual model here for sedimentary rock sites as well. So what I'm starting to observe here at the Cambridge site is we're into stage 5 and stage 6. We have evidence of this plume front shrinking back toward the source zone, getting smaller and smaller and moving back toward the source area in the subsurface rather than flushing out through the system to the receptors. So we have lots of guidance now with different and how to do hydrogeologic site conceptual model building. And I think one of the takeaways here from the data that we've been collecting is how valuable high resolution characterization data can be in terms of informing the processes and informing, therefore informing our conceptual site models well enough to do good prediction. And this endeavor then is essentially a multi-scale endeavor, and we've spent time thinking mostly about the fracture matrix scale that informs the bulk plume scale. And now I'd like to pivot toward understanding the flow system conditions, which are essentially the framework for our thinking in terms of risk to receptors. And this really, in my opinion, boils down to focusing on where our aquitards are present in the system. And what we're proposing here is to use detailed hydraulic head profiles to indicate the presence of these aquitards. So we'll go to the Wisconsin site here. In the Google Earth image, we can see the extent of the plume outlined in yellow. It's 4 kilometers in length in the direction from west to east, or moving in the direction west to east, just outside of Madison, Wisconsin, which is in the south central part of Wisconsin. So the hypothesis that I was taking forward here with my PhD student, Jessica Meyer, was that if we put in a detailed high-resolution multi-level, we'd be able to measure hydraulic head with depth and determine the position and thickness of low vertical hydraulic conductivity units. And we suspected that those units may not align with the lithostratigraphic framework that's most commonly used when we go out to field sites to drill our wells and instrument our aquifers or aquitard systems to understand what's going on. So in this case, we wanted to test with hydraulic data the position of those low K units. So here we have a design drawing of our initial West Bay system put in at the site. Numerous ports, we positioned the seals and the ports to minimize cross connections. So we're using core and geophysical data to inform those placements. And we have a large number of seals in this borehole to minimize cross-connecting effects. Conceptually, the head profile is going to show us kinks or head loss where low vertical K exists. And in the recharge area, we're going to see a change in head to the left. And in a discharging area, we're going to see a change in that vertical gradient to the right. And we don't expect, some of those head losses may occur at lithostratigraphic boundaries or not. So this is a set of data at multiple snapshots here showing the repeatability of these head profiles. And what we were pleased by was the regular nature of the head loss. So zones of negligible head loss and zones of appreciable or measurable head loss. And we related that to what folks were reporting in the literature for sedimentary systems, that joints as part of this 3-dimensional fracture network are likely to be are likely to terminate at bedding features. And those bedding features could be permeable or bedding partings, or they might actually be the clay beds or fine-grained units or surfaces that don't allow these fractures or these joints to propagate across them. And we tested that with a layered fractrand simulation to show the nature of the head loss that we might get in a dense network of fractures, but in multiple stacked units. And that was published in 2008. At the site, going back to the field data, we had 5 high-resolution West Bay multi-level systems installed over a 5-year period. And these data are shown here, essentially showing us going from recharge throughout the entire profile to diverging flow condition in the middle of the plume and toward the plume front. But the main thing to see here is the lateral continuity of these lower vertical hydraulic conductivity zones shown in green, separated by zones of higher vertical hydraulic conductivity in gray. And then we corroborated that hydrogeologic conceptual framework with contaminant data. Diane Austin was working at this site and collected our early VOC concentration profile, and we see that the concentration variability aligns nicely with the boundaries of these hydrologic units that were determined from the head profile. And so Jessie Meyer presented this alternative or revised hydrostratigraphic conceptual model shown here on the right. And I show the original conceptual model that we started with based on conventional wells and drilling that had been done prior to the research work going on. So now I'd just like to pause for a second to point out the importance of these 3-dimensional flow system views and thinking that was promoted so much by Bob Farvolden and many of the colleagues that worked with Bob or were influenced by Bob. And so what we need to remember as contaminant hydrogeologists is that our plumes are going to migrate along these flow paths, and these flow paths are diving deeper into the system before they come back up in the discharge areas toward the receptors. So we need to be not just paying attention to a single hydrologic unit with the plume, but thinking about where those groundwater flow paths may be directing those plumes down through retards and so on. So bringing it back to Bob Farvolden, which I've already mentioned, I thought I would just emphasize the early work that Bob started on three-dimensional flow systems was at the Alberta Research Council as the first division head of the groundwater division. And Joe Toth and Peter Myboom and Frank Patton were all there at the same time as Bob Farvolden, all I think being influenced together about this approach to thinking about hydrogeology, which was counter to the prevailing approach done elsewhere, which was more two-dimensional and map view. And Bob was particularly influenced by M. King Hubbard, who wrote the theory of fluid potential in 1940 with the classic diagram of a homogeneous isotropic flow system based on that fluid potential theory. So Joe Toth picked this up mathematically and worked with this throughout his career. And Peter Myboom published field data and showed the influence that infamous prairie profiles that are shown here. And also interesting to note is Al Fries had worked with Peter Myboom as a field assistant for a couple of summers while he was a PhD student working with Paul Witherspoon. And clearly this thinking carried with Al Fries to Berkeley and influenced his PhD topic. And this seminal paper or series of papers that came out on the importance of permeability contrasts on influencing the potential field, and perhaps bringing to the foreground the value perhaps of these head profiles that I've been presenting. And this links to Frank Patton, who invented the West Bay system. So this is the first engineered multi-level system used for geotechnical engineering as well as hydrogeology. So Bob went to Illinois to get his PhD after he was in the Alberta Research Council, and Burke Maxey, his supervisor, moved to the University of Nevada, taking Bob with him as his student. And what was remarkable there is there was a group of well-known groundwater thinkers that worked together in the Desert Research Institute there with Bob Farvolden before he returned to Illinois as a professor in 1964. So here we've got, I guess the Burke Maxey was his supervisor, and he wrote about hydrostratigraphy. And he was pointing out back in the mid-60s that geology alone wasn't a predictor of perhaps these hydrostratigraphic units that he was thinking about and defining a term for. And that's where Jesse Meyer and myself have seen great, a foundation to build off of here with the field data that we've been collecting, emphasizing the importance of hydraulically calibrating your geologic models to inform hydrogeology conceptual models. So this brings me to an important point that characterization is a very distinct objective than monitoring and relies on higher resolution data, perhaps, than monitoring would require. So on the left, we have a characterization style of data, and on the right, we have a informed distribution of monitoring ports with much less density. So the toolkit that we have to operate with now in fractured rock, though, has been expanding greatly over the last 20 years. And what I want to talk about now is the value of these flexible liners manufactured by Flute and how they give us a great opportunity to temporarily seal a borehole and then deploy sensors in these boreholes, or perhaps deploy sensors down a sealed borehole. And so I've highlighted those in blue here and muted the rest of the toolkit that we have available to us, which is quite expanded compared to what we were working with 30, 40 years ago. So here we have some views of the flexible fabric liners. They're polyurethane coated nylon fabric, and they come to a site on a reel, and we avert them, turn them inside out essentially as we drive them with a hydraulic head down a borehole. And you can see the characteristics of the seal with the video camera view that's shown on the right-hand side. So Pete Pemme has taken these images from a video camera, sent down the same borehole, more or less at the same depth, showing how that liner is pressed up against the borehole wall to create the seal. The main opportunity here is to remove the effects of a cross-connecting borehole, but also to deploy sensors that give us increased sensitivity for measurements, as well as taking advantage of the natural gradient or the natural flow system conditions. I'm going to talk about two types of sensors today, although there are many more types of sensors and samplers that we've been using. Point sensors that I'm showing on the left, and distributed sensors or fiber optic cable sensing that I'm showing on the right. Here you can see John Munn and Tom Coleman deploying these sensors and the liner. So we can put the point sensors on a string. We can position them based on previous data from the borehole or core and get the data along that profile. And data such as this is commonplace now at our research sites and across the city of Guelph, where we're doing a lot of work these days. So we get high resolution depth discrete head data, and we can get it continuously at whatever temporal frequency we're interested in. And what we see here is the diagnostic head loss that may not be predictable in terms of where it's going to occur in the system without such data. So what we're emphasizing in our research program now and with our collaborations is not only the high spatial resolution that we can get with temporary deployments, but we can also get more or less continuous temporal measurements that give us high resolution sensitivity to perturbations in the system, including teleseismic type monitoring that gives us insights about the hydraulic properties of the subsurface. So fiber optic cables are really popular in hydrology today and in hydrogeology. And we've been using a particular customized fiber optic cable where we've added a heating cable along with the fiber optic cable so that we can deliberately add a known amount of heat and enhance our ability to measure temperature variability in the system and quantify depth discrete zones of flow in the fractured system. This is a Google Earth view of our observation network, our fractured rock boreholes at the Arboretum in Guelph that we've been building over the last 10 years or nearly 10 years. And this is an opportunity for us to do fundamental research, advance and test new methods and compare them to more established methods and collaborate with vendors and research scientists. So I'd like to now move to the Slurian Dolo stone aquifer. Here you can see Guelph, Cambridge, and Waterloo that are all groundwater-based communities, and Guelph and Cambridge are reliant on this dolostone aquifer. I started my collaboration with the city of Guelph in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, when OGS and my group and the city ventured forth to put in tier 3 high-resolution monitoring systems, so multi-port systems designed with engineered multi-level systems available commercially. So at the regional scale, you can see the red dots represent those 10 multi-level locations. And then additionally, you can see some other research sites that I've been working on with other landowners throughout the area. And then if we go internal to the city, I've got a number of sites where I've been studying contaminant plumes and or collecting data to observe the nature of the flow system internally. So 3 different engineered multi-level systems give us different levels of resolution spatially, but we're trying to identify the position of these aquitards, and all of our multi-level systems are giving us an indication of lower vertical hydraulic conductivity zones within this Slurian Dolostone sequence, but highly variable across the region. And so this kind of informs this cartoon that was drawn more than a decade ago, kind of representing the glacial sediments being quite variable in thickness, and the presence of bedrock valleys are commonplace, but we have the Guelph Formation overlying the Aramosa and Goat Island formations that are thought of as regional aquitards, although perhaps with discontinuous in places, and then Gasport being the major transmissive zone. So we'll take a look at a single profile that happens to be located in Guelph at the Arkell Agricultural Research Station, and we can see the typical head loss zone that occurs through the parts of the Vinemount and parts of the Ancaster, which is shown on the left profile. And what we can see co-located here is the tritium data that was collected in the same multi-level. At this site, we see the strong presence of an aquitard and the effects that it has with attenuating the tritium concentrations, although evidence that there's perhaps a window through this aquitard some distance away. At another location not far away, we can see a very distinct profile of head where its head loss is not observable because we're proximal to a pumping well, and we can also see the effects on the tritium data is also more dramatic. And one of the things that we're concerned about is not only the natural windows in this aquitard, but also the cross-connecting effect of long-screened open wells. And so these flute liners are being adopted as temporary seals for these water supply wells that are unused, and they also serve as an option for other wells in the area that may be cross-connecting. So in wrapping up here, we're thinking about our groundwater resources and how valuable they are to sustaining our communities, and yet it's our anthropogenic activities that threaten these aquifers with various types of contaminants or nutrients that might be getting into the systems. And we mostly think of these threats coming from surface or near surface with all these activities that we're involved in. And so this is just a cartoon kind of representing the style of these contaminants, of these point and non-point source contaminants. And one of the things as we're thinking about where we are standing now and into the future are some of these, what we call emerging contaminants, but essentially they're already contaminants in existence, and we're just really just discovering them because we're looking for them. And we have to update our conceptual models and frameworks for these contaminants because they'll have different chemical and physical properties in these systems. But we're also becoming more aware of threats from below. Certainly the influence of legacy oil and gas wells, concerns about casing vent flows and the leakage of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, the ability to store CO2 and other gases in the subsurface are all going to depend on our aquitards and how intact or their integrity. So some key points to think about as we continue to address these hydrogeologic issues. Our conceptual site models that we use to inform our decision-making have to be informed at the process scale and over multiple scales. Cores are an essential tool for helping to inform the processes as well as higher resolution characterization data sets before we commit to a monitoring network or structure. And the good news is over the last 20 years or more, the number of tools and methods available for studying bedrock sites has increased greatly. And all of this is, I'm advocating all of this based on the principle that you can't manage what you don't understand. And our prospects for making finer tuned decisions is going to improve with that thinking. So here we are in the midst of a global water crisis. We may not feel it here yet in Canada, but I think it's upon us, and we need to be thinking about how we're managing these fresh groundwater resources that are dramatically impacted not only by pumping and overdraft, but also by water quality, and managing those problems concurrently. And these challenges are exacerbated by the changing climate, as we're reading about in the news every day. And I guess I'd like to just emphasize here that we need to continue to focus on the three-dimensional flow system as proposed to be important by Bob Farvolden long ago. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Beth. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, and can you hear the applause all around from 260 folks?
I'm imagining.
Just imagine, it's a remarkable presentation. Thank you so much for all the effort putting it together and making it so coherent and clear. And one thing that struck me was how you could demonstrate a strand of research that starts off with some initial conceptual models and over time how it can evolve with new insight, observations in the field, new technology, and to be able to get to a point where it's advanced so much that it can now solve problems, super complex problems. So it's just remarkable to see it.
Well, thank you. I see all the remaining questions, but it is fun. It is fun to think about the connections all along the way.
And questions are if you still can stay with us, I'd like to encourage folks, if you have, I'm sure there are questions, and if you do, please open up your Q&A box there and ask a question, and we'll try to get that on the table here for Beth to consider. And so as people do that, let me just start with one. You mentioned the Sanford Waterloo natural gradient test, which was one of the sort of initial ideas of putting a contaminant underground and watching it move. And I'm just wondering if you think there's still a need to do that type of a release in the field. Is that behind us now, or are there other? You mentioned all these other emerging contaminants, and is there still space for that in our field?
Well, I think there's still space for it scientifically. I reached out to Neil Thompson a couple of years ago to talk to Neil about PFAS and what he knew about them and whether or not he was thinking about Borden experiments for PFAS. And he had been thinking about it because one of his students was certainly actively dealing with PFAS problems and collaborating with Neil. And so we've been thinking about it and talking about it. I guess we're wondering about whether or not the attitudes or acceptability to managers for doing these controlled releases remains out there. But I was part of a methane gas release experiment that we conducted in 2015, and it was hugely valuable to do that work. Aaron Cahill and Colby Steelman were leading that project, and we got 8 papers from that experiment, and that's very much in tune with the Borden experimental site is so well characterized that the insights come, I guess, very efficiently forward with that level of background knowledge. And the ability to know what you're putting in, when you're putting it in, the characteristics of that release, and so on, take a whole bunch of unknowns out of the problem solving. So yes, I think there's still a role for them. I guess I would hope that we would find ways to do them in ways, probably without much risk associated with them.
still remember some of the looks on faces of our American colleagues when we were saying what we were releasing into the ground surface and being allowed to do it. And maybe those days are behind us.
Yeah, they used to think it was only the Canadians.
Only Canadians. So one question has come in. I'm not sure if you can see it, but I'll just translate it to you here. Do you have any comment on the usage of dual porosity models to simulate indiscrete fracture networks?
Well, it's a very good question, and one that we've been playing around with over the last several years, because one of the things that's difficult about these discrete fracture matrix models that they're being called right now, FracTran and Hydrogeosphere are two great examples of them, is that we can't really handle very large domains with the density of fractures that we want to put in them. So Paul Martin and Darren Abbey from Matrix and now have been working with me on these sites. And so we did a comparison of dual porosity permeability models and equivalent porous media models to evaluate what it would take to get them to reasonably represent the plumes that we were observing. And they can do a pretty good job, is what it depends on the question we want the models to answer. But I guess the takeaway that we took from our efforts was that we needed to know, we needed the style of field data that we had collected to inform the geometry of that dual porosity system. So you still kind of have to go after the type of field data that I was presenting here today. Fracture frequency, hydraulically active fracture frequency.
And there's even a follow-up that fits perfectly with this then, just I think along the lines of how you were explaining it. So Guy Patrick asks, he noticed that you'd never used the phrase equivalent porous medium, and wondering if that's an old term now, it's no longer really used in assessing fracture systems. That's his first question. And then following on to the discussion with FracTran, are there other good modeling tools besides FracTran that you consider? And of course, you're starting to address that, but in groundwater flow and fractured rocks.
Yeah, so the term equivalent porous medium, I don't know that it's an old-fashioned term, but I guess what strikes me about the validity of the term is the character of the plumes that I've been studying show reasonable, predictable behavior. So at the bulk plume scale, so I think one of the challenges we've been facing without understanding these plumes is there was a prevailing conceptual model that plumes and rock are going to be chaotic. And there's going to be a superhighway fracture that we just can't seem to find, kind of a needle in a haystack type problem. That's the short circuit that's creating the risk. And what we've observed from these studies is there's many fractures that are interconnected, and therefore the plumes are reasonably well behaved. So in essence, at the plume scale, I like the concept of the equivalent porous medium view. But I guess it has to be founded on understanding the details. And yes, FracTran is a workhorse. It's an amazingly efficient and computationally efficient tool, and we still use it regularly. But Hydrogeosphere is probably the more versatile tool in discrete fracture matrix mode that we've become reliant on as well. And other tools I think are being developed that can do discrete fracture matrix modeling. So there's several commercially available or open source tools out there that can do discrete fracture matrix modeling.
So let's see here. And I also want to mention it in the chat, which you'll get to see later. Many folks are thanking you, and you'll have a chance to see that after. But if we'll carry on a bit with the questions. Coming again from Hien Pham, you touched on this, but can you comment more on parallel / difference between PFAS diffusion in fractured media versus TCE? That's
I
a
wish
challenge.
I was a chemist, because PFAS is a type of contaminant that makes my head spin. I have to admit, I'm a physical-based contaminant hydrogeologist. So the Pfas properties, they're surfactant style type contaminants, and that's makes them trickier. I think they like to hang out at interfaces and so on, which is a very interesting scenario. From what I understand of the 4,000 or 5,000 and growing list of PFASs that people say exist, is that they can be highly variable in their characteristics, their chemical physical characteristics. And they're the new forever contaminant, because that carbon fluorine bond is so strong. So it's thought to be even more resistant than chlorinated and brominated chemicals to degradation. But I can't say much about diffusion other than I think it's readily accepted that diffusion is operative in the subsurface, and we should be expecting it to have an influence for sure, either in a transport distance or perhaps more thoughtfully in a flux perspective. So can't help you with diffusion coefficients though.
Excellent. Excellent. So, and I know my colleagues will be anxious for us because we have some other parts of this, of our final day today to go through, but let me ask you one more here. So this is coming in from Richard Schmidt, and the question is, all the sites you were looking at today were primarily sedimentary systems. And have there been specific studies in metamorphic systems? Maybe some of the systems are metamorphic. Anyway, that's the question.
Some of the dots on my map are metamorphic, and that's a new thrust. For the last 5 or so years, we've been trying to translate some of the tools. Some don't need translating, but the rock core method has been used in metamorphic rocks, and we actually have to scale almost right back to the fracture surface, but it has been useful to identify active fractures and inform those sites. So we're just really getting rolling with metamorphic rocks and igneous rocks, but we have probably 10 sites that we've worked on in the past 5 years or so. But, you know, a lot of the geophysical and borehole hydrophysical tools and the temporary deployments that we're all excited about, I think are great in any hole that can stay open. So Bedrock.
Yeah. So since they haven't cut us off yet, let me ask you a couple more here that have just come in. So a question coming from Patty, Patty. Beth, could you elaborate on how your work has been used in the consulting field to investigate DNAPL, and could you provide some examples? I guess one in Cambridge is a good example.
I think the biggest struggle has been that regulations have been written more or less with the conceptual framework around unconsolidated aquifers, or how plumes behave in sand and gravel, and then in a particular focus with chlorinated solvent DNAPL type source zones, how persistent the NAPL phase is in porous media. And so mostly I'm invited to work at real sites when the site owners or the consultants are struggling to get decisions that are practical and reasonable in their fractured rock sites to good effect. And so they're looking for evidence of matrix diffusion. And I think the impracticability argument was a big saver from a Bedrock site perspective for the last 20 years. But I think now what we're starting to see more and more of is interest in these new sensor tools and how high resolution data doesn't have to be expensive, and how the insights are really helping to make the right decisions, either about remediation or even just keeping our well field safe and not impacted by these plumes that are probably going to be there for a while, but we can operate around.
Excellent. And I'll have this as our last question. It's a very good one coming from Michael Friend. And Mike asks, you had mentioned this at the very end of your talk, and what are your thoughts on the long-term reliability of deep carbon sequestration concepts, where some recent research has suggested that it's virtually impossible to guarantee long-term containment of CO2 that'll eventually leak out, since it's such a long-term scale. What even a minor leak could be of concern.
Yeah, hi, Michael. And I guess what, I'm learning this secondhand, really. I think Maurice Dussault's work and Dick Jackson and others now, Mary Kang from McGill and others, they're really starting to bring forward the importance of seal leakages that can develop over long periods of time. That's a concern with old oil and gas wells that have been abandoned or sealed. And I think the same thing holds true going forward with CO2 storage. That's how well can we seal these casings in the ground. But one thing I would advocate right away is it would be nice if we could put the casings and seal down to the depths of an intact or good integral aquitard, so that we're not just blindly deciding the depth to which we seal things, but perhaps do that with some information about the thickness of the freshwater system and a good protective zone below that to help inform those things. But I do think that that's a really important area of uncertainty that we have, is the longevity of containment.
And is there some information and insight we can gain from tracking how natural gas reservoirs are maintained? Arguably, natural gas has been there for such a long time. We drill into it, manage it in different ways. I wonder if there's something we could gain from looking at how those reservoirs are.
Well, that's a really good point, Dave. I guess I think it's not so much the integrity of the natural system, because I think the geologic evidence would be that we have excellent aquitards or even aquicludes in the subsurface. But if we're going to drill through them and rely on seals to maintain a good seal around that borehole, maybe that's the biggest risk.
So perfect. So I think, Beth, with that, we'll stop the questioning. And thank you so much for taking all these questions and taking the time to go through them carefully, and appreciate it. We know it's a long time to give the talk and then answer all the questions. So, so much appreciated.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to more feedback. If people are interested in reaching out to me, it'd be great to hear from them.
And we'll ask folks, if you please reach out to Beth. I think we can find her email and other connection points easily through the G360 on-site as well. So what I'll do right now is pass this over to Tony Latimer, and Tony will move to our next stage. See you again, Beth.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Dave. Hope you can hear me. And thank you, Beth. The next stage, by the way, I'm Tony. Dave introduced me, but I'm the chair of the Farvolden committee, the alumni and staff of Farvolden committee. And the next step is I'm going to turn it over to Lorraine Albrecht to do the draw for the prizes from the registration. So I'm just on for briefly. Lorraine, can you take it from here?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. In this hat here, I have all the names of the 376 people who registered. So I will pick 2 names to win a UW gift card, which will be mailed to your home address. Okay, so good luck all. See, lots. So the first name I'm drawing is James Plett. So congratulations to James. And the second name I'm drawing is Christopher Holmes, H-O-M-E-S. So congratulations to Christopher and James. And now I will send it back to Tony.
Thanks, Lorraine. Okay, this brings us to the close of the 2021 Farvolden Lecture event. And so on behalf of the Farvolden Committee and the alumni, I would like to thank Beth Parker for agreeing to be the 2021 lecturer and continuing the tradition with her excellent presentation. Thanks so much, Beth. And also